Bro, what are you watching? Oh, dude, I'm just watching the show about people that got killed, tortured, murdered, abused, beaten, mutilated. Why? I don't know, man. It's just so calming and peaceful, honestly. That's concerning. Whether you belong on a list or just have a morbid curiosity in how these twisted people's minds work, this video is for you. One thing to quickly note is that this list is not based off kill count alone. The scary factor is based off of their general vibe, their story, and also their methods. Let's begin. Starting off strong, we have Ted Bundy. This man is literally nightmare fuel. Why was Ted so scary? For me personally, it comes down to a few reasons. Primarily being how unassuming he came off. He was literally a wolf in sheep's clothing. He was well educated, charismatic, charming, although he had a truly twisted and dark side that only came out once you were alone with him. Besides him being almost completely hidden in plain sight, he was also a master of escape and literally escaped police twice. And after the second time he escaped, he committed 6 more murders, which is literally insane. Something that I find completely ironic is that Ted actually attended law school for a year, which is super random, but I mean, it's not the first time something like that's happened. Once he was finally caught, he eventually admitted to over 30 murders, abducting, assaulting, and murdering young women. And during his trial, he even partially represented himself. And during his sentencing, he literally proposed to his girlfriend. This dude was loving the attention and is a complete lunatic. Next up, we have Harold Shipman, aka Dr. Death. If you thought that name was bad, trust me, it gets worse. Harold was a family doctor in the small town of Hyde in the United Kingdom. Harold was well known and well respected in his community, and a majority of his clients were the elderly. This might seem a little bit random, but this fact is very important. Now, let's kind of step back and look at his history. In his early years, he was the primary caretaker for his mother with cancer, and that led him to seeking out medical practice. He became a doctor, had a family, and had a successful practice, although he did end up developing a drug habit that almost cost him his practice. He was fined on multiple drug charges and even went to rehab, but was considered cured by the end of his treatment and was free to practice once again. Once he continued his practice is when things really began to take a turn. Specifically, elderly women began to die under his care. Shipman would use any reason possible to use a hypodermic needle on his patients, which he would use to deliver them a deadly dose of morphine, causing them to overdose. The interesting thing is this was the same medicine he gave his mother when he was younger. Like Ted Bundy, Shipman is terrifying because of how unassuming he was. Not only was he respected in the community and well known and a family man, but he was also a family doctor. Probably one of the last people that you would assume to be ending people's lives intentionally. Another really scary factor was that his patient base was so vulnerable. And unfortunately, early on, a lot of his victims were just written off because of old age. Shipman was found out because before he killed his last victim, he modified her will to have her leave everything to her family doctor, aka Shipman. Her family was suspicious and they investigated. After a thorough police investigation, it was discovered that Dr. Death was responsible for over 215 deaths. Absolutely terrifying. Third up, we have Andrei Chikatilo, aka the Rostov Ripper or the Butcher of Rostov. He was a serial killer from Soviet Russia. The fact that he was in Soviet Russia actually played a big part in the reason why he was able to go on for so long. The state-controlled media was not allowed to talk about serial killings or anything of the sort, specifically because they believed that they did not have that issue. They didn't have serial killers, they thought. They believed that to only be a Western phenomenon. Following the trend, Chikatilo was just an unassuming traveling businessman, although his urges were much deeper and much darker. And unfortunately, Chikatilo was the type of person known as a necrosadist, someone who gained arousal from pain and violence and murder. Chikatilo targeted runaways, prostitutes, and homeless people as they were considered undesirables or less dead. Over time, the evidence was undeniable and the police were starting to suspect a group was at the loose, and even the general public was starting to believe that there was a werewolf just because of how gruesome the bodies were left. Unfortunately, these investigations were not fruitful simply because they were not looking in the right places. They were literally investigating satanic cults and recent psychiatric ward alumni. It wasn't until they brought in a psychiatrist that they were able to begin making progress and realize that maybe the killer was a normal seeming businessman who could be among us. In an interesting turn of events, Chikatilo was literally caught at a bus stop talking to a potential victim and was found with Vaseline, rope, and a knife in his briefcase. Although once he was brought in, his blood did not match the DNA on the killings and he was only held for a theft he committed. It wasn't until a few years later he was once again brought back in to the police station, and at this point they knew they had to get him. Although they didn't have much evidence and time was ticking before they had to release him again, it only took a 2-hour conversation between Chikatilo and the psychiatrist to have Chikatilo crack and confess to everything. Chikatilo was responsible for the gruesome death of 56 young men and women and was sentenced to death by a bullet in the back of the head. All right, things have gotten pretty dark, but we're just getting started. Let's just take a quick breather together. It's so crazy to think about how twisted these individuals are. Something I wanted to quickly mention is that this video is in no particular order. These individuals do not deserve a ranking, and I will not be giving them one. All right, buckle up. We're jumping back in. Next up, bringing us back to the US, we have Jeffrey Dahmer. Dahmer is probably one of the most infamous and well-documented serial killers of all time. If you know anything about Jeffrey Dahmer's story, it's not hard to believe why he's on this list. He is one of the most depraved individuals likely to ever exist. From a very young age, he was experiencing intense, violent thoughts, and it didn't take long for him to begin acting on them. From the years of 1978 until his arrest in 1991, Jeff had killed 17 people in uniquely horrific and gruesome ways. Jeff would drug, assault, murder, assault again, chop up, eat, and more to his victims in the bodies of his victims. Not only would he drug, assault, murder, and eat his victims, but he would also mutilate their bodies and keep parts of their body as souvenirs. He even said himself that this made him feel closer to his victims. He says that he didn't want to kill anybody, it was just his only option as he wanted companionship. According to him, his ultimate goal wasn't to murder, he simply wanted a slave who he could control completely and not have to worry about any of their wants or desires. This man was truly, truly twisted. And because there was no death penalty in Wisconsin, he was actually sentenced to 973 years in jail, although he was murdered in jail by a cellmate, thankfully. Following the trend of disgusting, disturbing cannibals, we have Joachim Kroll, a disturbing serial killer from Germany. Joachim had an IQ of 76, which is just above the line of being considered mentally challenged. Kroll would primarily find his victims by either going to smaller towns outside of where he lived, or simply strolling through and hiding in the forest waiting for victims to pass by. Kroll targeted women and young girls specifically, with his youngest victim being 5 years old. He would typically start a conversation with a victim and then shortly after strangle them to death and then assault their corpse. He shortly after began cutting chunks of his victim's body off and taking them home to eat. The bodies of his victims were typically found a few days after the incident, although they were never linked to him. And one of the most unfortunate parts of his story is that typically people close to the victim would be considered primary suspects, and there was multiple completely innocent suspects who ended their own lives out of sheer frustration and embarrassment of being considered a suspect. As I'm probably sure you've realized at this point, it's very common that a lot of these people were not necessarily deemed to be serial killers just at a first glance. Even in his own apartment building, Kroll was known as Uncle Kroll to the local children as he would give them treats and allow them to play with dolls in his apartment, which he kept to lure the children. Kroll was eventually caught after he killed a neighborhood child. He tried to dispose of the remains of this child he didn't want in the toilet in the shared bathroom, and as he left the bathroom with the toilet clogged, he told one of his neighbors not to go in there. The toilet was clogged. His neighbor still went to use the bathroom and saw the horrible mess that was in the toilet. He contacted the police, and the police quickly investigated and questioned Kroll directly. They forced their way into his apartment and saw that he was cooking a stew. Kroll quickly admitted to everything, and they noticed that the stew literally contained human remains from the victim they were searching for. This man was seriously a monster. Moving over to South America, from Colombia specifically, we have Pedro Lopez, also known as the Monster of the Andes. If you thought it was frustrating and just nonsensical how the police didn't catch any of these people earlier, you're gonna absolutely hate how this story goes. Lopez was literally found guilty of murdering 110 girls in Ecuador alone, but he also confessed to killing an additional 240 women across Peru and Colombia. Now, obviously for having over 300 alleged murders, he is obviously sentenced to death, right? No? Well, he's at least sentenced to life in prison, right? What if I told you that he was literally released on good behavior and now his whereabouts are completely unknown? I'm not making this up, by the way. Pedro Lopez was literally released in 1998 on good behavior and now his whereabouts are not known. I seriously cannot fathom whose idea this was and how they could justify this at all. On top of being somebody who just murdered hundreds of people, something that is extremely scary about this person right now is the fact that they were born in 1948, meaning that right now in 2023, if they're still alive, they're only 75 years old, meaning that if you just see an old person walking down the side of the road, they might be the monster of the Andes. Insane. This next entry on our very disturbing list brings us back to where we started in the USA. This entry is our third American and final entry. His name is John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy is probably one of the most deranged individuals on this list, and if you've heard of Jeffrey Dahmer, you've probably heard of John Wayne Gacy. Gacy was a businessman and politician and was a liked and respected community figure. Like most people on this list, he was rather unassuming and, unfortunately, living a double life. Gacy had a family, a wife, a child, but that didn't stop him from assaulting young men, and although they were silent for some time out of fear for their lives, eventually they came out with their story, and Gacy was charged and imprisoned. Like the previous entry on this list, he was released on good behavior. Absolutely wild. After he was released from prison, he was essentially able to get a fresh start in life and was able to get a job, find a new wife, and start a construction company that was able to be quite lucrative, although it wasn't long until he was at his antics once again. Gacy developed an alter ego named Pogo the Clown, which allowed him to express parts of himself he felt that he had to repress. He appeared at birthday parties, community events, and did magic for children in the hospital. Unfortunately, these displays only brought him closer to his darker self. Gacy began cruising around at night in his full clown getup and would force young boys to get in his vehicle at gunpoint and then assault them and murder them and bury them in his basement. Gacy was eventually caught because his basement was so full of bodies. His last victim he actually had to ditch in a local river. This body was shortly after found, and the police were able to connect the dots and immediately began investigating Gacy. It wasn't long before they got a warrant, searched the basement, and found the bodies. It's interesting because Gacy always denied the accusations and even claimed that the bodies in his basement was a setup to destroy his political career. This man was a complete lunatic. And with that, we conclude my list of the scariest serial killers from around the world. Let me know in the comments the most infamous serial killer from your country if I didn't mention one already. This video is only my 5th video, but was definitely the toughest video I've ever made. Doing research on this video was honestly pretty brutal, and I tried to keep this video as tame as possible for what it was. And if you want detailed, explicit explanations of what happened with these people, there is tons of video out there around that. What I wanted to create was just a simplified version that kind of gave a brief overview of different serial killers from around the world in an interesting way. This video was kind of lacking jokes for obvious reasons, but my next video should be a little bit funnier. I think most people would like to believe that when you do something wrong, it'll catch up to you, whether that be legally or even just karma. But as we all know, that isn't always the case. And that's why today I'm going to be discussing serial killers who were never caught. Horrible people doing horrible things that unfortunately were never served justice. At least not yet. One quick note before we begin is that these are real criminals with real victims, and I'm going to be doing my best to be respectful as possible. This video isn't in any particular order, even though this video is a list, simply because I do not want to put any of these people above or below each other. All of these people are horrible and do not deserve a ranking. Now let's get into the video. Starting off, we have the Servant Girl Annihilator. A pretty gruesome name, but he was a pretty gruesome guy. And I felt like he was an appropriate first entry for this list because he was the first known serial killer in the United States of America. Between December 1884 and December 1885, he killed 7 women and 1 man. And he had a very peculiar signature. He killed people with an axe. In just one night, on December 24th, 1885, you're right, Christmas Eve, he murdered 3 victims with an axe, which is why they also called him the Austin Axe Murderer. For obvious reasons, there's not a lot known about this killer, and that's going to be a common trend among all of these killers, unfortunately. And a lot of what is known is the sheer brutality that happened to the victims, and for also obvious reasons, I won't be going into too much detail on that. But one interesting detail that I thought I would share is the fact that there's a rather interesting conspiracy floating around with the Servant Girl Killer, specifically being that he could potentially also be Jack the Ripper. Why? Because this string of murders in Texas happened 3 years before the murders of Jack the Ripper across the pond. Could they be the same person? Personally, I'm not sure if there's any validity to it, but it's an interesting thought. Next up, we have a rather interesting situation as this entry isn't just one killer, it's likely many. I'm talking about the Highway of Tears killers. The Highway of Tears is a 719-kilometer long corridor of Highway 16 between Prince George and Prince Rupert in British Columbia, Canada. And this stretch of highway has become notorious for murders that have happened on it. The crimes happening on this highway date back to as early as 1970 and are still believed to be happening to this day. Due to poor economic situations and the lack of public transportation, for a lot of the poorer citizens, hitchhiking was a big method of transportation, leaving vulnerable individuals at risk. Unfortunately, in that case, that meant many Indigenous women women were at risk. Almost all of the victims of the Highway of Tears were Indigenous women, and there is believed to be at least 80 missing and murdered Indigenous women. One of the saddest parts about the stretch of highway is that a lot of these victims were never even found and are still considered missing and not homicides. And focusing on the criminals, the one interesting part is that only one person has ever been convicted on this highway, and unfortunately, they were only convicted for one murder and could have only possibly been able to commit 2 of them, meaning that there are likely many murderers still out there not served justice. Following that, we have the Oakland County child killer, also known as the babysitter killer. And this story is seriously twisted. As the name may imply, this killer targeted children in Oakland County. Between the span of February 15th, 1976 and March 16th, 1977, only 13 months apart, 2 boys and 2 girls aged 10 to 12 went missing outside of their homes. Each child's body was discovered in a public area within 20 days of their disappearance, and all of the children were either strangled or shot. The 4 deaths triggered a murder investigation which was at the time the largest in U.S. history, and the breaking of this news also caused a significant panic among parents in Michigan. Despite a few promising leads, including the discovery of a vehicle suspected to belong to the killer, this case remains unsolved. In 2012, we had the most recent development, which investigators were able to actually create a DNA profile of the killer. But unfortunately, this didn't match up to any of the suspects or even anybody in the police database. A quick note to mention is that the 4 victims I mentioned are only confirmed victims, and there is potentially many more. And the timeline I mentioned is only the confirmed timeline, and many more could have taken place outside of that. This is just what is confirmed for this killer. Staying on the topic of murderers who targeted children, we have the alphabet murderer, also known as the alphabet killer or the double initial killer. If you haven't noticed already, a common trend is these killers having pretty obvious names, but I don't think it hurts to spell it out. This killer had an affinity for matching initials, and all 3 of their victims had the same first and last initial, with the victims having the initials CC, WW, and MM. These unsolved child murders took place between 1971 and 1973 in Rochester, New York. I'm starting to think it was pretty rough being a child in the 1970s. All of the alphabet killer's victims were assaulted and strangled, and despite the fact that there was witnesses, specifically several motorists who saw 10-year-old Carmen Collin half naked on the side of the highway attempting to escape the killer, the police were never able to close the case. Although police did have several persons of interest, one of them connected as recently as 2011, none of them had close enough ties to the murders to be convicted. Although interestingly, one of the alphabet killer suspects was sentenced to death for murder for killing sex workers in Nevada. Completely unrelated. Strangely though, all of his victims in Nevada had the same first and last initial. Could this be the alphabet killer from New York? Seems very possible. Shifting our focus over to Scotland now, we have Bible John, an unidentified serial killer who has killed at least 3 young women between 1968 and 1969. All of Bible John's victims are believed to have met him in the Barrowland Ballroom, a popular dance hall in Glasgow, Scotland. Most of the few details known about this case come from one of the victim's sisters, who shared a taxi with her sister and the alleged killer, Bible John. The victim's sister's information helped the investigators form a psychological profile of the killer, with one of his biggest quirks being that he frequently referenced the Bible, hence his nickname, Bible John. Unfortunately, in 2010, the victim's sister has passed away, and we have lost the only eyewitness, meaning that the chances of this case ever being solved are unlikely. Returning back to the United States of America, we have a killer with probably the most outrageous name. I'm talking about the West Mesa Bone Collector. The United States media really does a good job of giving serial killers names that are way cooler than they deserve. And also just more gruesome. Like, who thought of Servant Girl Annihilator? Like, annihilation, that is an insane adjective to use. Back to the topic at hand, the West Mesa Bone Collector was a serial killer in West Mesa, Albuquerque, New Mexico. This is also one of the most recent entries on the list, as the remains of 11 women were found buried in 2009 in the desert of West Mesa, obviously. There are at least 13 other potential victims of the West Mesa Bone Collector, reported as late as 2006, who were just not buried in this one mass grave. So, confirmed 11, but potentially all the way up to 24 and beyond. Like many on this list, the police considered several suspects, but lacked enough evidence to make a strong enough case against any one suspect. Some theories suggest that the West Mesa Bone Collector may actually be a group of people involved in running a sex trafficking ring, specifically because a lot of these victims were sex workers. As recent as 2021, the police have confirmed that the case is still active. And despite the fact that the police are still receiving 20 to 30 tips per year, there is no new evidence moving the case along. Truly unfortunate. If you haven't heard about any of the killers I've mentioned in this video so far, that's about to change, because the next two killers I'm going to discuss are arguably some of the most well-known serial killers of all time. And that starts with the Zodiac Killer. If that name rings a bell, you probably watched the 2007 Jake Gyllenhaal and Robert Downey Jr. blockbuster movie, Zodiac. That movie has no doubt made the Zodiac Killer the most infamous unsolved serial killer in all of American history. The Zodiac Killer has confirmed to have killed 5 victims and injured 2 victims across the span of 1968 and 1969. But he claims that he has killed up to 37. Now you might be asking yourself, what do you mean claim? He wasn't caught. How did he talk to the police? Well, that's kind of where he got his name from. The Zodiac coined his name in a series of taunting messages that he mailed to regional newspapers, in which he threatened to go on killing sprees and bombings if they did not print his messages. Some of his letters included cryptographs and ciphers, in which the killer claimed that he was collecting the victims as slaves for the afterlife. This guy was twisted, and that's not even the start of it. Out of the 4 ciphers that the Zodiac made, 2 remain unsolved, and 1 was actually successfully cracked in 2020. Only 1 suspect has ever been named publicly by authorities, and due to the weirdness of this case and the sheer depth of the rabbit hole, there is a large public interest in this story. And I could honestly go on for hours about this with just publicly available information, but for the sake of this video, these are the important details. If this is interesting to you, I highly recommend you do some research on it, as the story does go deep. The last correspondence from the Zodiac Killer with any sort of publication was in 1974. The case has been marked inactive and then reactive a few times over the years, and in some places is still considered active to this very day. But unfortunately, even with all of the public interest, it is unlikely that this case will be solved. And now, the moment you've all been waiting for. Like I said, this video isn't in any specific order, but I did keep this one for last. One thing I will mention though is that this list isn't every single uncaught serial killer. Unfortunately, there is still a lot more that exist. I just couldn't make this video super long. But if you would like a part 2, I will gladly make it. And for the identity of our final killer, well, that's unknown. This is likely one of the most famous unknown serial killers, and also just serial killers to ever exist. I'm talking about Jack the Ripper. Even if you're not somebody who binges morbid content or watches serial killer documentaries on the weekends, you've probably heard of this name before. Jack the Ripper was an unidentified serial killer active in the slums of London, England in 1888. Jack's attacks typically involved women working as prostitutes who lived in the slums of East London. These women would have their throats cut and then have their abdominals manipulated. The removal of internal organs of at least 3 victims led to the suspicion that the killer had some surgical knowledge. The official numbers and even motives are unknown, but there are believed to be at least 5 canonical victims of Jack the Ripper. Much like the Zodiac Killer, the Jack the Ripper lore goes much wider than the scope of this video. But one interesting point I wanted to make is that a lot of what solidified Jack the Ripper's legacy was unintentionally created by the media of the time, which is also the case for a lot more recent serial killers, for example, Jeffrey Dahmer and the like. It's a rather interesting byproduct of spreading awareness, and I thought I'd mention it. But that's it for me, at least for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and if you like this one, you'd probably like our video on scariest serial killers from around the world. Trust me, bro. Hey, do you want to know a scary thought? You know, like serial killers? Well, before they were all caught and put in jail or even executed, you know that they were just living in public with the rest of us, right? Yeah, creepy. Not too long ago, I covered the topic of serial killers that were never caught. Some of these were more recent, but a lot of them were older cold cases. If you haven't seen that video, it's linked in the description for you to watch after this one. But what I want to do in today's video is go a little bit deeper and discuss currently active serial killers that are still on the loose, meaning that they are very much so alive and very much so free and very much so still in the habit of murdering people. Now buckle up and let's get started. We are starting this list with an individual known as the Jeff Davis 8 killer. In the mid to late 2000s, the Jefferson Davis Parish in Louisiana was thrust into the national spotlight due to a string of unsolved murders. 8 women, now known as the Jefferson 8, were killed and dumped into swamps and canals around the city of Jennings over only a 4-year period. The connections between these victims in this case is striking, as all 8 victims were discovered to have known each other quite well, and 2 of them were even cousins. The victims at some point in their lives had also acted as police informants and even reported reported on each other at times. This also led to the families believing that the police were somehow involved in their deaths. That theory was further supported by the 2016 book Murder in the Bayou. But as far as we are concerned, right now there is absolutely no leads on who could be the killer or killers involved in murdering these 8 women. The chance of this killer still being at large is extremely high. What do you guys think? Simply rural towns being underfunded and not being able to solve a complex series of murders? Or did the local police want to get rid of their string of informants? Hence, all of them disappearing and no evidence being found, and a large delay in there even being an acknowledgement of all of these murders being connected in one way or another. It's very fishy, and it's unfortunate that justice hasn't yet been served. Moving on, let's discuss the I-70 killer. In case you're unfamiliar, I-70 or Interstate 70 is one of the longest highways in the entire United States, connecting multiple states from Utah all the way to Maryland. And if you didn't know, those are on opposite sides of the country, so it's pretty long. However, unfortunately, in 1992, this route became the hunting ground for a dangerous individual known as the I-70 killer. The confirmed cases attributed to him include the death of 6 people who worked in convenience stores along the highway. Most of them were young women with brunette hair, with the exception of one male, being the only I-70 victim who was male. Because this killer found his victims on such a long stretch of highway, the police were completely unable to connect any meaningful dots. And even though the police and investigators from each respective city and county were able to compare notes, there was no solid enough evidence that allowed them to get any sort of suspect. And the most progress they were able to make was 2 composite sketches of what the killer could look like, which unfortunately never brought anyone to justice. It's honestly shocking how far technology has come and how seemingly easy it was to be a serial killer not that long ago. These cases only took place in 1992, 30 short years ago. And the fact that the composite sketches showed a young man, likely only in his 20s or 30s, the chances of this killer being out on the loose and alive and even active today is extremely likely. Next up, we have the Long Island serial killer. Like the rest of these cases, this one's crazy. In May of 2010, a 24-year-old woman named Shannon Gilbert disappeared, so the police conducted a search looking for her along the Ocean Parkway in Long Island, New York. And while unfortunately they did not find her body, they found something they did not expect at all. They found the remains of 4 other missing women. What started out as a simple search for missing women turned into the investigation of a lifetime, searching for a serial killer who's currently on the loose. Over the course of a few extra months, police found more remains belonging to 6 other people, a total of 10, and the connections were made. The killer mostly targeted sex workers who put up ads on Craigslist. And although there was a lot of effort put into a lengthy investigation, and there was even suspects and persons of interest, which is a first on this list so far, there was absolutely no arrests made, and the Long Island serial killer may very well be still active, as they're still on the loose. Truly sad and unfortunate. Alright, let's get out of the States for a sec and go over to Asia, specifically Japan. This entry is not only strange, but also really scary, and you'll see why very soon. As some of you may know, Japan has a huge obsession with vending machines. It's a huge part of their culture, and it's honestly pretty cool and convenient to have so many cool things readily available almost everywhere. On average, there's 1 vending machine for every 23 people. That's a pretty high ratio. But between April and November 1985 in Hiroshima, 12 people were killed and another 35 were injured due to paraquat poisoning. What is paraquat, you may ask? Well, it's a popular herbicide or weed killer. When the authorities started to investigate all of these deaths, they started to notice one thing in common. They all had consumed a drink called Ornamic C. Now, at the time, Ornamic C had a marketing campaign going on where if you made a purchase at one of their vending machines, you would get an Ornamic C for free. It was a type of orange beverage. In Japanese culture, sometimes the people would place the free drink on the top of the vending machine so someone else could take it if they didn't want it. The police soon caught on and figured out that someone had been tampering with these free drinks on the top of the machine, poisoning them with paraquat. It was almost impossible for the police to track down anybody responsible, and because there was already so many fingerprints on the drink from the person who originally got it to all of the people that may have touched it, and the lack of CCTV at the time, there was almost no evidence. And unfortunately, this person was never found. It's very likely this person could still be around today, and whether they're a serial poisoner or not, I would say there's a good chance that they're probably up to no good. I don't know about you, but this definitely makes me question any type of free drink I may be offered in the near future. Well, unfortunately, we couldn't stay out of the States for too long, and now we're back discussing the Eastbound Strangler. This name has a very odd and gruesome origin. In November of 2006, 4 bodies were found in a drainage ditch near Atlantic City, New Jersey. These bodies would all be identified as women who earned a living as sex workers in the area. The women all were lined up and appeared to be strangled, hence the strangler part of the name, but strangely enough, all of their bodies were facing eastbound, which is why they called him the Eastbound Strangler. It's a strange name with an even stranger meaning, but what's most strange is that this killer was never caught. Keep in mind, this case happened in 2006, not 1985, so there was a decent decent amount of technology to help solve this case. And for that reason, there was DNA evidence that was retrieved, but unfortunately, all this DNA evidence was able to do was clear the names of the only suspects that they had because there was no match. Despite there being a $25,000 reward, the Eastbound Strangler was never found and very likely walks among us today. I don't know about you guys, but if somebody goes and strangles 4 innocent people, I would say that they're probably not just going to stop at that, which is why I considered them for this list of active killers. And for good measure, let's just add one more strangler, specifically the Chicago Strangler. From 2001 all the way up till 2018, the deaths of at least 50 women in the south and west sides of Chicago have had the Chicago PD stumped. Like in other cases, unfortunately, a lot of these victims shared very similar attributes. They were African-American female sex workers in the area, and as you might have assumed, they were all murdered via strangulation. Because a lot of these victims and cases have provided no suspects, the term Chicago Strangler has been used as somewhat of a blanket term to identify the killer or killers who are still at large. The silver lining of this case is that some of these cases have been solved and closed, but unfortunately a vast majority of these strangulation victims have not been given justice, and unfortunately they likely won't. In 2019, a task force was set up to reinvestigate the cases. Somewhat strangely, in my opinion, they have not been able to provide any evidence to validate the theory that there is one perpetrator, meaning that they believe there's either multiple perpetrators or simply no connection between the cases. And for me, I believe that there's too much in common between all of these cases for these to simply be coincidental and completely unrelated. But what do you guys think? It's very sad and disheartening and honestly scary that this sort of thing is still going on, and the fact that these situations were still happening up until 2018 leads me to believe that this is still happening to this day. And for the last entry on this list, we will be jumping over to Russia. We have the Danilovsky Maniac, or the Maniac with Dull Eyes. He gets the nickname from a vague description given to the police, and he's on this list because between 2004 and 2007 he killed at least 7 women. He's also been believed to be active as early as 1999 and as recent as 2010. Like basically every monster on this list, he targeted young women, assaulted them, and murdered them, and hid their bodies in construction sites around Cherpovets, Russia. This killer left crude drawings at crime scenes to taunt the police, and even with over 200 people being interrogated and a reward of over 500,000 rubles, the identity of the maniac was never solved, and unfortunately, he is still very likely among us today. One very important note I want to make at the end of this video is that all of the victims in this video are real, and all of these situations are very real and very unfortunate. And with that, I try to be as respectful as possible when covering sensitive topics like this. Let me know your guys' thoughts on these situations, and please, if you haven't already, check out some of my other videos on serial killers. Thank you so much for Nord for sponsoring this video, and thank you guys for being such cool fans and being supportive of creators getting compensated. And if you are looking for cybersecurity, please check out NordVPN using my link in the description. It helps out the channel a ton and gives you a great deal. But until next time, that's all for now. Trust me. Who left this little random baby in the park? How you doing, little guy? Are you okay? Why are you so ugly? You look ugly and you look stupid. Funny, yeah, well, at least my parents didn't ditch me in the woods, so yeah, enjoy eating rocks for dinner. Peace out. When you think of kids, you probably think of cuteness, innocence, and maybe brutal honesty. But one thing you probably don't think about is evil. Well, in this video, I'm gonna be talking about kids that did evil things. And whether or not it's my place to say if someone is truly evil or not, I don't know. But what I do know is that everything I'm about to mention that these kids did was definitely evil. Now let's get into it. Starting off our list, we have Josh Phillips, who was only 14 years old when he committed his evil act. Phillips grew up in Pennsylvania, but he was moved to Florida with his mother and abusive drug-addicted father. One very important and interesting detail about the story is that there was absolutely no signs that Phillips could potentially be capable of what he ended up doing, at least none that were reported. He was described as quiet and friendly by neighbors in Florida. The mother of Josh's victim even said that her daughter and Josh were good friends and she had no reason to be scared of him. Teachers even described him as a popular kid who didn't stand out, and he had no prior criminal history. So what exactly did Josh do to end up on the list of most evil kids? According to Phillips, on November 3rd, 1998, he was home alone when Maddie Clifton, who lived across the street from Phillips, came to his house asking him to come outside and play baseball. Phillips agreed even though he knew he wasn't allowed to hang out with friends when his parents weren't home. As the two were playing baseball, according to Phillips, he hit Clifton's eye, causing her to bleed, cry, and scream. Phillips panicked knowing that his father would come home soon and he was fearing his reaction. Phillips dragged Clifton into the house saying that her clothes came off as he dragged her into the house, and then he hit her in the head with the baseball bat to stop her from screaming before putting her under the base of his bed. When Josh's dad came home, he chatted with him for a bit and then went back to his room to see that Maddie was still alive in his bed. He at that point removed the mattress and then stabbed her 7 times with a knife, killing her. Maddie's disappearance was reported 5 p.m. that day, and there was a 6-day long search looking for her, which Phillips participated participated in. I think one of the most unfortunate parts about the story, besides the absolute tragedy of Maddie Clifton's death, is the fact that Philip's mother was the one to discover the body in his bed when she was cleaning his room and noticed a wet spot. Prosecutors have a few issues with the story that Josh told, specifically being that it is very unlikely that her clothes came off when he dragged her into the house because there was no dirt on or around her clothes, and the fact that there was no blood on the bat or in the backyard, making his story have almost no validity, and unfortunately, we will probably never know the real story. Moving on, we have Edmund, or Ed Kemper. Kemper was born on December 18th, 1948 in Burbank, California, and he committed his atrocious act at only 15 years old. At least the first of his atrocious acts, but we'll get there. On August 27th, 1964, Kemper was sitting at the kitchen table with his grandmother when they unfortunately had an argument. Angered, Kemper stormed off and grabbed his rifle that his grandfather had given him for hunting. He re-entered the kitchen and shot his grandmother in the face once and then shooting her twice more in the back. Kemper then waited for his grandfather to return home from grocery shopping, where he shot him in the face in the driveway. At this point, Kemper didn't know what to do, so he called his mother and she told him to call the police, which he did, and he waited to be arrested. When in custody, Ed shockingly reported that he just wanted to see what it would feel like to kill grandma. If it hasn't already become obvious yet, this video is pretty dark, and it's only gonna get darker, so buckle up. Kemper was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic and was sent to the criminally insane unit of the state hospital, where he shockingly only served 5 years. Kemper was able to be released so early because he was able to convince his psychiatrist that he was rehabilitated, and he was released on his birthday, December 18th, 1969, which to me is criminally negligent, knowing what I'm about to discuss. If you had any hope that Kemper was successfully rehabilitated, I am extremely sorry to burst your bubble, but that is simply not the case. Upon his freedom, Kemper decided to viciously murder 6 women and even kept their heads as trophies. He then killed his own mother and his friend, and at that point turned himself back into the police. He says that his justification for the killing spree was that he wanted to get revenge on his abusive mother, and now that that was complete, his job was done. This kid was definitely evil. That being Graham Young, also known as the serial poisoner in England. Born in London on September 7th, 1947, Young's obsession with poison and poisoning things began at a very young age, and unfortunately, that obsession was able to flourish and develop as it took a while for people to catch on. Young used his family and even classmates as lab rats for his poisons, all of which made them extremely sick, but didn't kill them yet. Graham's preferred method of delivering this poison was in his victims' food and drink, a very unsuspecting place. Graham's first official murder took place on April 26, 1962. Yes, Easter Sunday. Graham's stepmother passed away shortly after drinking some tea that Young had added chemicals to. Fortunately, some of his teachers and even his own aunt grew suspicious of him and called the police. Young was arrested, and at the age of 14, while being detained at the Broadmoor Hospital, he pledged guilty to 3 non-fatal poisonings and even admitted to killing his own stepmother with poison. Now, unfortunately, similar to Ed Kemper, because Young was held at a mental institution, his stay was rather short, serving less than 9 years. And upon his release, he went on to poison 70 more people, killing 2 of them. Young was once again arrested on November 21st, 1971, where he was ultimately sent to jail, where he eventually died of a heart attack. Was he poisoned? Nobody knows, but it's a happy thought. Following this serial poisoner, we have a trio of evil children, those being Paul Gingrich, Chase Williams, and Colt Lundy. 15-year-old high school freshman Colt Lundy, with the help of 2 of his friends, shot his stepfather in the chest 4 times, killing him. Lundy's friends and co-conspirators were 12-year-old Chase Williams, who was on lookout during the evil act, and 12-year-old Paul Gingrich, who also shot Lundy's stepfather. One of the craziest parts of the story is why they killed him. Was he an abusive drunk? Was he the worst father ever? Well, according to the boys, they just wanted to run away, and they felt the need to kill him so he wouldn't catch them and get mad at them. That is definitely some 12-year-old logic. Another crazy detail is that Paul Gingrich, at only 12 years old, was the youngest person ever to be tried as an adult and was served 25 years. Lundy received 30 years, and Chase, who stayed outside on watch, got 6 years in a juvenile corrections facility. What all of these boys did was evil, but do I believe that all of these boys were evil? I'm not sure. But but it definitely seems that the older boy was a negative influence, to say the least. Next up, we have David Brahm. Similar to Ed Kemper, David Brahm's evil act was triggered by a simple argument. But as we learned with Ed Kemper, an argument can turn vile. And unfortunately, that's exactly the case with David Brahm as well. Around 11:30 p.m. on the night of February 17th, 1988, Brahm had gotten into an argument with his dad once again about the music he was listening to. For Brahm, this was the final straw, and the next morning, Brahm took an axe to his father and is shockingly reported saying that his father kept getting up and he had to keep hitting him to keep him down. So that's it, right? He just killed his dad because he was mad at him. Unfortunately not. Immediately after killing his father, he then killed his mother and 11-year-old brother and younger sister, all with that same axe. Now, weirdly, but also fortunately, hours later, Brahm asked a female classmate to skip class with him, which she did, and during their time together, he confessed everything to her. He then turned himself in, where he was arrested and sentenced to 53 years in prison. I really don't think that there's any debate on whether or not this 16-year-old who murdered his entire immediate family with an axe was evil or not. Up next, and our second last entry on the list, is Kiplin's Kip Kinkle, a seriously twisted individual. Kinkle never liked school and performed very poorly, and even had to repeat the first grade and was eventually diagnosed with a learning disability. But that is absolutely no excuse for the evil acts he committed. By only the 8th grade, Kiplin was hiding guns in his bedroom and was caught ordering books on how to make bombs and even shoplifting. But these acts are going to seem like child's play when I tell you about the true evil that he committed shortly after. On May 20th, 1988, 15-year-old Kiplin was arrested and expelled from his high school in Springfield, Oregon, after a stolen gun was found in his locker. That night, after returning home from being interrogated by the police, the teenager pulled a gun from his secret stash and killed both of his parents. And if the story ended there, it would be a very gruesome tale, but unfortunately, that's only the beginning of the story. The next morning, Kiplin brought his entire gun collection to school and opened fire in the cafeteria, killing 2 students and injuring 25 more. Some rather heroic students were able to control the situation until police arrived, and disturbingly, while questioned, Kiplin said that he heard voices in his head instructing him to kill, and that he himself wanted to die. He is now serving an 111-year sentence. Truly an evil individual. Our final entry on this list is maybe one of the most shocking because of how recent it was and also because of how young this evil child was. In 2007, a very young 8-year-old Amarjit Sada claimed the title of the world's youngest serial killer. Sada was born in a small, poor village in India in 1998. In 2006, Sada killed his 6-month-old sister, who was left at a primary school to be taken care of while his mother was running errands. Sada took her out of her crib at the school and brutally murdered her and buried her in a shallow grave, and then later returned home like nothing happened. When questioned by adults whether or not he did such a thing, he freely and proudly admitted to this evil doing and even brought people to the grave. He was arrested and when questioned by police, simply smiled and asked for cookies. There isn't much more known about this truly terrifying and tragic case, but one of the most scary elements about it is that he was only sentenced to 3 years under Indian law, and he is now free to live his life however he pleases. I understand he was only 8 years old, but that sort of evil activity in a person needs to be monitored long term. But for now, that's all from me. Thank you guys so much for watching this video, and let me know what you guys think. Were these kids evil, or were they just simply a victim of their circumstance? To me, it seems like there's a lot of elements at play, but it never justifies their actions. Thank you guys so much for watching, and also thank you Ground News for sponsoring this video. I know the Trust Me Bros are very supportive of creators getting that bag, so I appreciate you guys watching the integration and maybe even checking them out. That's all for this video. Until next time, trust me, bro. The most evil women in history. It's a pretty well-known fact if you look at my channel that you guys like morbid content. Whether it be killers, torture methods, or mythical creatures, you guys like weird and scary. But unfortunately, with most of these topics, one thing I haven't really covered is women. And I'm all about inclusivity and equal representation. So in this video, I wanted to switch it up a bit and focus on the women of evil. Dangerous, evil women that kill people and more. And if you thought women were scary before this video, they're gonna be terrifying after. Let's begin. First up on our list is Beverly Allitt, one of Britain's most hated serial killers. She worked as a nurse in the the children's ward in the UK and ultimately intentionally injured 13 of her patients and murdered 4 of them in the process. The 9 that did survive weren't much better for wear and were seriously injured. Beverly would administer lethal insulin injections and also inserted air bubbles into the bloods of her victim. One of the saddest parts about this story is that all of these crimes were committed in only a 2-month period, and all of her victims were infants, one of which was only 2 months old. One of the scariest parts about this story is that Beverly had no clear motives, and due to her mental health concerns, she wasn't held in prison. She's currently in a secure hospital. It is so extremely unfortunate that in such a short amount of time, this woman was able to inflict so much damage upon so many young, vulnerable people. It's truly disgusting. I suppose the silver lining is that she was relatively quickly found out after only 59 days or just under 2 months, but even one child harmed is too many in my books. Let's move on. Next up, we have Leonarda Cenciulli, a dangerous female killer from Italy. This story is a trip, so just try to follow along. To put it frankly, this woman was a nut job. She had a very rough upbringing and was extremely superstitious. Her family mistreated her, and that led her to rebel and marry a man that her family didn't approve of. She was then banished from her family, and she believed that her family had put a curse on her that would only allow her to have negative experiences. And she believed in this curse heavily. You'll see what I mean. She dearly wanted to be a mother, but unfortunately, out of the 17 pregnancies that she had, only 4 of her children survived. One of which was her son, who she loved dearly and would do anything to protect. She saw a palm reader, and the palm reader told her that all of her children would die before her, and she didn't want to believe it. Not too much longer later, in 1939, the World War II draft happened, and her son was of age to be drafted. So what did she do? Well, she thought she could have a human sacrifice to protect her son. What she did was she targeted vulnerable middle-aged women that were unhappy and unmarried and promised them a life of good fortune and much more. The first victim she invited over, she told to write all of her friends and family's postcards saying that she's so happy in life right now, and also told her to not tell anybody what she was doing. This victim came to Leonardo's house, drank wine that was poisoned, passed out, and Leonardo killed her and cut up her body and turned her body into soap and tea cakes, which she served to her friends and even her son. But unfortunately, it doesn't stop there. This one sacrifice that she did to protect her son in the war wasn't quite enough for her, so she ended up doing the same thing again 3 more times. But she was eventually caught as her last victim's sister was growing concerned of where she could be, and fortunately, she heard that her sister, the victim, was last seen going into Leonardo's house. That prompted an investigation where both Leonardo and her son, Giuseppe, were taken into custody, where she promptly admitted to everything and pled guilty to all of the charges. This case is so strange and morbid, and I honestly can't understand how one can be so superstitious. But there has to be more going on here, because nobody who's just superstitious ends up eating people. Disgusting and crazy, honestly. I know I put a lot of time into this story specifically, but I thought that this context was kind of required, and I thought that this story was just too crazy not to give more detail on. There's no doubt this woman is evil and dangerous. Let's keep moving. This next entry brings us all the way back to the 1500s in Hungary with Elizabeth Bathory. Before I get into the details, I'm going to say this. There are 2 popular beliefs about the story of Elizabeth Bathory. One is that this entire story was made up and fabricated to discredit her and her family, and the entire situation was just a witch hunt to put her away for good. And the second belief, which I think that I'm a part of after doing some research on the topic, is that everything I'm about to discuss is historical fact and true, and this lady was an absolute maniac. Elizabeth was given the nickname Blood Countess, and even Countess Dracula, as she had very odd vampiric tendencies. Elizabeth was obsessed with her looks and preserving her youth, and unfortunately, she thought that the best way to do so was by bathing in the blood of her virgin servants, and that's exactly what she did. She began torturing, beating, and murdering them, and then draining the blood from their bodies and doing what she wished with it. Allegedly, her husband even built her a torture chamber in their castle where she could inflict horrific acts on the servant girls. Of course, she only had so many servants and consistently needed to recruit new servants to become a victim of hers, which she would prey upon the daughters of younger class families who felt blessed to have the opportunity to interact with the higher classes. Unfortunately, their daughters never returned home. After targeting the daughters of noblemen, formal complaints were submitted and Bathory was investigated, and her crimes were uncovered. She was convicted of 80 counts of murder, and in 1611 was confined to a room in a castle with only slits for food and air, and she died 3 years later. Now, I'll let you guys make up your own mind about whether or not this woman was dangerous and evil or not, but the fact that there is so much evidence, 52 collected statements, and the fact that this has stayed through history for almost 600 years, to me definitely says that she's not innocent and likely not a great person either, at the very least. But let's keep going. Now, bringing it back to the modern day in the United Kingdom, we have Joanne Dennehy, another one of the UK's most notorious female serial killers. She's also known as the Peterborough ditch murderer because she would throw bodies in ditches in Peterborough, where she lived. Kind of self-explanatory, but to put it bluntly, Joanna is a narcissistic psychopath who had a very unfortunate draw to men and extremely evil evil intentions. And by draw to men, I don't mean that she was interested in men. I mean that men could not resist her. She had some sort of magnetic personality that people were just attracted to. And this, unfortunately, isn't super uncommon for narcissists and sociopaths when you first meet them. Just for a bit of context of how evil this woman truly is she's by professionals and experts considered one of the most dangerous, if not the most dangerous woman to be in the criminal system in the United Kingdom right now as we speak. In March of 2013, Joanne and her accomplice, Gary Richard, had the grand idea of mimicking Bonnie and Clyde by murdering 9 men. And unfortunately, over the course of 10 days, they murdered 3 men and severely injured 2 others by stabbing them. She was eventually caught when the poorly hidden bodies were found. And if you want to really know how truly messed up this person was, when the first body was found, he was naked from the waist down and his top half was covered in a sequin dress. She specifically dressed up the body like this to humiliate him as his body was found, if killing him wasn't bad enough. Investigators immediately knew that they were dealing with a deeply disturbed individual, and after they caught her, they knew that they were exactly right. The first victim that they found was actually her landlord, and the next 2 victims were random dog walkers that they found on the road. There's a lot more deep and disturbing details to get into about this specific situation, and they're honestly more than the scope of this video without making it 10 hours long, but I think I covered most of the important details to convey the information that this woman is evil, dangerous, and straight up menacing. But we're not done yet. Let's keep going. This next dangerous woman was described by the judge of the case as evil himself. So if there's any entry fitting for the list, it's this one. This entry also has an interview available on YouTube, which I watched for this video, and it is very disturbing, and you can see exactly how strange and genuinely crazy this person is. The way that they were able to justify their crimes to themselves and just lie is absolutely astonishing, and well, I'll just say it's strange, and if you're interested in watching it, you can look it up. The last thing I'll say before I reveal her identity is this. This case is very odd because if you watched our last video, you'll notice a common theme of serial killers focusing on sex workers. But in this case, it is the complete opposite. This dangerous woman was a sex worker who killed her clients and made them her victim. If you don't yet know who I'm talking about, I'm speaking on Eileen Wuornos, also known as the Damsel of Death. Like essentially every serial killer, Eileen had a very troubled upbringing, and this no doubt led to the life that she led. She worked as a sex worker in the 1980s along highways in Florida, and between 1989 and 1999, she killed a total of 6 men in only a 12-month period. She would drug men, shoot men, rob men, take their cars, and drive their cars back to her home. She was ruthless, yet in court claimed self-defense, and although her sanity was questioned and very much questionable, she was not granted an insanity plea and was actually sentenced to death, where she did die in 2002 via lethal injection. There's a lot more entries that I could have put on this list, and there's a lot more I wanted to put on this list, but I just couldn't put it in the amount of time. We're a bit behind at the Trust Me Bro studio, so I made this video a bit shorter so we could get it out on time, so hopefully you guys can appreciate that. And if you liked this topic and want to see more, please let me know, and I'd love to do it part 2. Thank you guys so much for watching this video, and apologies again for the shorter video. I know you guys love the longer videos, but I'd rather give you guys a video than a late video or no video, so hopefully you guys can understand. Thank you guys so much for watching this video, and like always, trust me, bro.